I think most of the people that have completed an EV conversion are the people that are more backyard mechanics. None of it's insurmountable, but you can't go into it thinking that you can just go on some web store, buy all the parts you need, and drop it all in. It's a lot of planning and doing your due diligence. After that, the putting the stuff together is, I would say, much easier than doing a combustion vehicle.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Sasha from On Point Dyno and Mountain Pass Performance in Canada. This is Sasha's second time on the Tuned In podcast, and we brought him back to talk a little bit more about one of his key areas of expertise, which is electric vehicles. Now, we wanted to catch up on what's been going on in the EV world over the last couple of years. And I know this can always be a bit of a controversial topic when we're talking to motorsport enthusiasts. It can be a bit polarizing, but let's face it, like them or absolutely despise them, EVs and hybrid vehicles are going to very much be a part of our future. So why not embrace them, find out what makes them tick, and find out where their pros and cons are relative to internal combustion engines. And that's exactly what we're talking to Sasha today about. We talk about pros and cons of hybrid versus full electric vehicles, how the technology has changed since we last talked to him, and where that technology is going in the future. We also talk about some of the limitations of EV performance and why you can't just tune an electric vehicle to make more power. We also talk about some of the aspects of batteries, battery management, and battery life. We talk about the different components of an electric vehicle as well, including the motors and inverters and what they do. Now, while electric vehicles are obviously making up a big portion of the cars being offered these days in dealerships, there's also a continuing drive towards EV swaps, and that's obviously of interest to a lot of the enthusiasts that follow HPA. So we talked to Sasha about what's involved in an EV swap, what are the components we're going to need, and how we can actually go about that process. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpaacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpaacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, Sasha, welcome back to the podcast. Another one of our return guests, and we're obviously not going to dive right back into your complete background, because if people want to find out everything about your background, they can go back and listen to episode 45. But can you give us maybe a quick recap, a high-level overview of who you are and where you're from?
Hey, Andre, yeah, great to be back. Always love talking to you guys and working together. I would say, in a quick nutshell, I'm a guy that loves cars and had a race shop when I was younger. That moved into a dyno tuning business and kind of really started to love automotive electronics and developed a passion for EVs and kind of converted over my interest in electronics to doing an EV conversion, and then kind of falling in love with the new Tesla Model 3 and starting to build a company around developing high performance parts for EVs in general, high performance EVs. So suspension and brakes and wheels and a lot of the hard parts, as well as doing some cool electronics and offering EV conversions and those types of things to, one-off prototype experimental type vehicles. So we'll work with some tier ones and some OEMs to do things like four motor torque vectoring and different integration projects. So yeah, it's been a really, really cool path. And I also happen to have a hybrid 350Z, which is kind of like our science project on wheels that I get to enjoy driving at different events. So it's been fun the last few years with that thing.
I kind of like following that the 350Z project because to me you've kind of got a foot in both camps there. You've got a very highly developed engine, internal combustion engine, and then you've built your own hybrid system to sort of, I guess, get the best of both worlds. Would that be a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's like a science experiment. As you said, like I love the sound and that engine that we've been developing over so many years with Jim Wolf technology. I didn't want to just take it out and make the car fully electric. It's so the emotion to drive that car from that engine and the sound it makes, but it was never going to be competitive in a time attack environment.
Sure.
And if we added turbochargers, we would also lose that sound and the response. So the hybrid made sense from a business standpoint, and with those other factors considered, I wouldn't say it's the choice that would made the car the fastest, but I'm really happy now after a few years of running it. It's so fun. There's so much cool stuff you can do, and to see it all kind of come together, and the way the traction control is just beautiful, and I can dial the power up and down and have really consistent lap times, and fine tune the power so that at the end of straightaways it's starting to drop it down, and this way I can do 3 laps instead of 2, for example, without it overheating.
Sure.
Yeah, it's been really fun. As you know, turbo cars can be challenging. So
You're getting me at a bad time off the back of an almost non-existent endurance racing season. So yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole right now because if we do have time in this chat, I want to dive a little bit further into the Z. But just to give some fundamentals, could you let us know if we're talking about pure internal combustion engine power, how much is it producing? And then with the aid of the hybrid motor, what does that bring it up to? Just so we can sort of put some base numbers around it.
yeah, the engine's about 530 at the wheels, and the hybrid system brings it up to just shy of 700, about 680, 690.
Okay, yeah, that's no joke. That's not a small increase with that hybrid system. So yeah, I could definitely appreciate that's going to make a significant difference. Maybe still arguably not quite where you'd be if you decided to add a turbo or a pair of turbos to that engine. But yeah, I mean, that obviously brings its own set of considerations and issues as well. So there's no free lunches here.
Certainly, we would love to have a bit more, but I mean, when is it ever enough?
Yeah, never. We never stop wanting more. All right, what I want to do is sort of go through a bit of a recap. Our last interview with you was back, I think, somewhere in mid-2022. We're now nearing the end of 2024. So electric vehicles, it's a very fast moving sort of industry. The technology is changing quite quickly, which we'll get into this, I kind of see as on one hand a blessing and potentially on the other hand maybe a curse or maybe a flaw in the system. But could you maybe give us a high level view of what, if anything, you've seen as big leaps forward in that 2.5 years?
Certainly, I think the most significant things that stand out in my mind, now this might not be accurate, this is just what comes to me, is the adoption of the Tesla charge port in North America as a standard, and Tesla allowing other manufacturers to use a supercharger network. So this means now that you can kind of go wherever you want with different types of vehicles. It doesn't have to be a Tesla without worrying about whether a charger is going to be full or not working or whatever. And then also the cost of these EVs has come down significantly, used and new. And that's in large part due to the battery prices of batteries coming down. So it's similar to computers and phones with the electronics just becoming cheaper as the power electronics get more mature and as the battery manufacturing gets more mature.
Okay.
So yeah, that's been the main changes.
That's been the biggest sort of change in your eyes. Okay, so two questions that sort of come out of that. I think probably one of the stumbling blocks for mass adoption or larger adoption of EVs in general, maybe more particularly, I think in North America, has been around range anxiety. So this is kind of what you've just said there is hopefully an answer to that range anxiety. Basically, every manufacturer's car can use the Tesla supercharger network for faster charging if we're doing a cross-country trip, which we can't do on one single charge.
Yes, if you're the type of person that wants to drive 8 or 9 hours without stopping, an EV is not for you now, and it's probably never going to be for you. If you're the type of person, or you've got a significant other that needs to go to the bathroom every 3 hours, then an EV with a reliable charging network, you won't be losing much time to an internal combustion vehicle on a road trip. And you save a significant amount of time if you have a house because you don't have to go to the gas station once a week. So you just have a full tank every day that you wake up with, which adds up.
Yeah. I think that's something that maybe is easy to overlook, that exact point there. My business partner, Ben, his daily is a Mitsubishi minicab, which is the smallest, most laughable EV maybe on the face of the planet. However, exactly that. He said to me a while back, I can't actually remember the last time I went to a gas station. And those are the sort of things that you can easily forget about. He rocks it into the garage at night, plugs it in, and in the morning, as you say, full tank of gas. Admittedly, that tank of gas is good for about 70 kilometres, I think,
Yeah, that's not
maximum.
very much.
But I mean, it's not made to travel the length of New Zealand or the east to west coast USA. It's made for a daily commute, and I think in most cities, probably 70 kilometres would do the majority of your daily commute. So different tools for different jobs. Coming back to this from a non-EV owner, and the New Zealand market is probably at this stage quite different, I think, to the US and North American market. With the current state of that Tesla supercharger network, how thorough is that? I mean, how complete? If I wanted to drive,
Every 50 kilometers.
okay, so it is there.
Yeah, even if one is down, it doesn't affect you. Even if one is busy, it doesn't affect you because there are so many. You can go 5 or 6 or 7 superchargers in a full battery, so you can pick where you want to stop. And usually we don't think about it. Just start driving.
Okay.
So
And that's how it should be. It's how it needs to be, I guess, because that's where we've got to with internal combustion. Gas stations are pretty much everywhere in this year.
exactly. Yeah, you can't be worrying if I'm going to a charger, and this is the only shot I've got, and maybe this one's broken or it's full because there's only 2 stalls. That's not for sure. I would have anxiety about that. I wouldn't want that car. But when a Tesla supercharger's got 16 stalls, and if that one's busy, which it tells you in the UI of the car how many stalls are occupied, if that's busy, I go to the next one.
So you kind of know from the user interface before you even turn up at a supercharger station if there's going to be a free stall.
Yep, it tells you exactly how many are in use, and I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe it even projects, like in very, very busy superchargers, which we don't have in the northeast part of North America, but in California, I believe it even projects what the waiting time will be if it's full or if it will be full when you get there, if you're, say, an hour or two away.
Wow.
So it's quite clever for sure.
And the next obvious question that comes off the back of that one is how long are you going to have to spend at these supercharger stations? And I guess we'll preface this with it's going to depend on the state of charge when you pull in, I'm guessing.
Yep, and what you're driving, and of course how fast the supercharger is. But with everything optimal, you've got a low battery, you're at a new supercharger that has 250 kilowatts of power potential. If you're on a road trip, you'll typically you'll come in at 5% or 10%, and you'll leave around 70. And that'll take you about 35 minutes and get you about 300 kilometers of extra range. So by the time you go in, you go to the bathroom, you grab a snack, you're back in the car. It's pretty rare that we don't get back to the car and it's ready to continue going to the next 3-hour stop.
All right, so we're talking substantially slower still than filling up a conventional internal combustion engine.
100%. Yeah, if you want to go across the country and you want to do it as fast as possible, you're probably losing 3 or 4 hours a day if you're driving for 10 hours. Like, it's definitely significant. But I don't think most people drive across the country regularly.
No, I mean, I think it kind of comes back to what I was just mentioning before about inner city commutes. Generally that's not going to require you charging during your day. So I guess in that instance, it becomes different tools for different jobs. If we're gonna drive cross country and we really don't want to be stopping, you want to do, as you mentioned, 8 hours non-stop. Well, at this stage, maybe still internal combustion is for you.
For sure. An example of that is my friend Alex took my Rivian and my race trailer from Toronto to, we're going to California for Laguna Seca for the Grid Life event. Obviously, stopping to charge every 150 kilometers with the Rivian would just be insane. So we stopped at the border and rented a Enterprise, whatever, gas truck, and we towed it with the gas truck that we rented for that week. And the rest of the time, the electric truck gets me to all the local races and does the towing we need and does all the other truck things we need. So
I think there's sort of a an assumption out there amongst the automotive enthusiasts that you're either an EV guy or you're not. And if you adopt EV, then there's no going back. I mean, the reality is obviously that's ridiculous. We can have one of each, and again, that gives you the flexibility to choose whatever suits the particular mission profile that you're interested in for that application. Now, I want to sort of talk a little bit about some of the negativity that I've noticed, I've heard about, is getting reported on around EVs that sort of come out, I think, over the last 12 months. And I want to preface this with, I am probably playing devil's advocate slightly here, but I don't want people listening to think that I'm an EV hater. I genuinely am not. And I see a future where EVs may not be the be-all and end-all of the automotive industry, but I think it's safe to say there's no doubt they're going to play a pivotal part of the future. But I think if we go back maybe even slightly before our 2022 episode where we caught up on EVs at the time, this was sort of a weird time. We were post-COVID, the economy's booming, heaps of cash has been printed and sort of injected into the economy, and everyone's feeling really good. EVs are also sort of rising in popularity there. There's incentives being offered by governments to, in terms of rebates. Obviously, depends on where you are in the world. Here in New Zealand as well, we weren't seeing what we referred to as road user charges. Basically, if you've got an internal combustion engine, every litre of fuel you pump into the tank, a certain amount of what you pay for that litre goes to the roads. Obviously, that doesn't happen with EVs. So with diesels, you pay separately for your road user charges, so every 1,000 kilometres, and that didn't exist for EVs. So obviously it was going to come, otherwise no one's paying for the road. So it was really appealing at that time to sort of jump on the EV bandwagon. I listened to a podcast sort of basically it keeps you up to date on sort of tech, and EVs came up, and the report was sort of on consumers in the US who had purchased an EV. This was done this year, 2024, whether or not they would purchase an EV as their next vehicle, and I think the report basically over 50% said that they would not. And I think this also comes off the back of we're hearing reports of incredibly high depreciation levels with the current crop of EVs. I think, and again, I'm quoting numbers that I can't specifically recall, so give me a little bit of leeway on this. The Porsche Taycan Turbo S was depreciating by somewhere in the region of something insane like 50% in the first 12 months of ownership. And then coupled with that, I'm sort of looking at it from my own perspective. All I see it taking is that next step in battery or motor or inverter or all three technologies. Manufacturer comes out with that next generation of car that's just that massive step forward, and all of a sudden the current crop of EVs are going to plummet like a rock. So there's sort of a thesis from devil's advocate. I'd like you to agree or disagree with that.
Well, I think a lot of people that owned an EV early on, if you couldn't access a reliable fast charging network, that would make you not want to buy an EV again. For sure, myself, I've been in a few non-Tesla vehicles going to different chargers in both North America and in Europe. And I've downloaded the app, I spend 15 minutes, it doesn't work. I got to drive to another charger. That one also doesn't work. Like, I'm not making this up. I go to 3 chargers and none of them work. So anyone that has that experience will not want an EV again, I guarantee you. If you go in and you plug your car in and it charges and you don't have to think about it, I would be interested to see if that survey, if you split it between supercharger users and non-supercharger users, what the responses were. I think a lot of people that buy Teslas buy another Tesla unless they're bored of it and they just want to change. But I don't think because fundamentally they had a problem with the vehicle, unless it was like an early Tesla and has really poor build quality or something.
Yeah, sure.
In terms of the depreciation, that's so difficult. Obviously, the market has been going crazy the last few years with everything that's happened, and some vehicles weren't in stock. So that, whereas EVs were, and as you said, EVs are rapidly improving. So they are kind of more like a cell phone type of technology where everyone wants the newest and greatest, which will make them depreciate. That being said, you don't have to buy a brand new car. And if a car depreciates a lot, then it's a great opportunity to buy a 3 or 4 year old car with 60 or 70,000 kilometers. And the amount of money you save from charging versus using gasoline is staggering if you drive a fair bit. So that would be my response to that.
I think that's actually a really good point. That is easy to overlook when you're looking at depreciation isolation. I mean, I think it's probably more important to look at your lifetime cost of owning a vehicle, and that's not just what it's going to hit you in depreciation. It's maintenance, there's servicing costs, and of course, as you mentioned there, fuel or charging. That's probably going to be a very substantial part of your vehicle ownership. So yeah, I think probably you need to have a more holistic view of what the car is going to cost you over the lifetime of ownership. But I mean, I tend to be pretty tight with my vehicle purchases anyway, and I don't think I've ever purchased a brand new vehicle because I don't want to be the chump taking the 20% hit or whatever that as you drive off the showroom floor, and that goes for internal combustion anyway.
Exactly.
No one thinks they're going to go and buy a brand new car and make money off it. Well,
right. And the thing about EVs was early on, they were not dropping in value. They were holding their value like crazy, and maybe some people thought that it was going to stay that way for some reason. And when it went the other way, that was a big shock. But it had to. It had to go like any other vehicle. That they're always going to depreciate because auto manufacturers exist on selling new cars. They can't sell cars once and never sell them again. So,
with some very few exceptions, if you happen to be in the rich and elite and have enough money and enough maybe authority to get your name on one of the hypercars that comes out in limited numbers and straight away jumps by maybe $1 million on release, but that's a very different world and certainly a different to what we're talking about here. Now, the other thing too, sort of reports that I've heard, which I also want to raise with you as well. So one of them is sort of Toyota's take on EV, and they've sort of bucked the trend a little bit in terms of, rather than embracing full EV, they seem to have decided that hybrid is the way to go. I'm interested in your take on that. Obviously, you've got the hybrid system in your Z, but a very different hybrid system. Pros and cons of a hybrid versus full EV?
for road car use, just like day-to-day driving.
Correct. Yeah.
So the problem with plug-in hybrids, I think there was some study I read, is that most people, humans are naturally lazy. So most people don't plug them in. Or they plug them in for the first year or whatever, and they get lazy and don't plug them in. So if you're not plugging it in, then it's just a regular hybrid. And a regular hybrid it's recovering some energy when you're slowing down and braking. But I mean,
You're not really getting the full benefit.
you may as well just have a gasoline. You know what I mean? So I love the idea of hybrids, but humans are not disciplined enough to use them properly. I mean, I lived it with my wife. Like, I hope she doesn't listen to this episode, but I was constantly the guy telling her to plug in her car. And it was, if I didn't say something, it wasn't plugged in. So maybe I've lived this a bit too much, but that is my experience with. Now, if you're a car person and this is your thing, you're sure you're going to plug it in. But most people, yeah, that's been the issue I think with a lot of hybrids. And then of course there's the issue with starting and stopping the engine constantly. So the maintenance costs I mean, I wouldn't own one out of lease. Like, I wouldn't own one out of warranty. I mean,
Yeah, well, the way I see it is you've sort of got the complexity disadvantages of both systems. The complexity has just got to be out the gate. I love that you raised the fact that people don't plug in a plug-in hybrid. We about 9 months ago went through looking for a new car for my wife, and we'd actually ended up, while the last car was being repaired at one point, we ended up with I think it was a Jaguar F-Pace plug-in hybrid. And I gave that a crack. because I thought, plug-in hybrid, I'd like to go full EV. There was nothing that really suited our family at the time. Plug-in hybrid looked like a good option because, again, my wife's sort of daily commute's probably sort of 50 kilometres, which was covered by full electric. And the problem I sort of saw with it was twofold. I kind of like did the math in my head, and one, I kind of figured exactly like you, she probably was maybe not going to be that consistent at plugging the thing in. Secondly, that F-Pace, I think it was like 400 horse when it was the hybrid system, internal combustion plus the electric. But if you wanted to drive electric only, it was like, I don't know, like 120 horsepower or something. It's gutless. And my wife is definitely not necessarily a petrol head, but when she's doing that school drop-off, she needs to get there faster than the other car. So I could kind of see that was not going to last too long. So we ended up going away from that idea and ended up with full internal combustion. So we went full circle from EV to plug-in hybrid and back where we started. I don't know. Maybe it was the wrong choice, but maybe given what you've just said, maybe I kind of was onto something there after all.
I think so. I think the plug-in hybrid thing, it's not perfect. I think a lot of manufacturers like to sell it as a perfect solution, but I think there's a lot of omissions with the downsides.
Sure. The other thing here in New Zealand, and again, this will be locality specific, the road user charges that I talked about, there was nothing on EVs as an incentive to sort of get mass adoption. That's finished now. So we're back to road user charges. The cost per kilometre is lower for a plug-in hybrid than it is for a full EV because obviously you're still paying for petrol. But again, I saw what was going to come from that plug-in hybrid is the plug-in part was not going to be used, and essentially we're just going to be paying road user charges on an internal combustion engine, which kind of, again, didn't really make a lot of sense to me. All right, the next one, which I was a little bit excited about, am a little bit excited about even, and to me, this probably makes a lot of sense, is Porsche are pretty heavily invested in both internal combustion and full EV vehicles. They've got options there, but what they also are doing, which I think is quite smart, is working quite hard on synthetic fuels or sustainable fuels, and they've built a pilot plant, I think, in Chile to sort of take, I'm not a chemist here, but I think they take water and CO2, apply a huge amount of power, and it creates a synthetic fuel. And essentially, other than the power being used to create that fuel, when you burn it, there's no net sort of emissions output. At the moment, and again, don't quote my specific numbers, I think the last time I heard about it, which wasn't that long ago, the fuel at the moment they're producing is ridiculous. It's something like 15 or 17 bucks a litre. Obviously, a long way away from being viable for the wider population, but also this is a pilot plant, and as the technology scales up, I assume we're going to get economies of scale come in there, new technologies to create the fuel. I guess it can only come down in price. What's your thoughts around that type of fuel giving internal combustion engines a bit of a new lease of life?
Well, first of all, I love anything that makes internal combustion engines able to continue and enjoy the emotion and the sound that we are attached to. There's no doubt that there's something that they have that a quiet EV doesn't have, that same full emotion. That being said, I don't think it's going to be economically viable for a long time. It's probably a bit of a marketing move. I think it'll make sense in the aviation space well before it would come to automotive. I mean, I don't know how much power goes in to make a liter of gas of this fuel that you were saying takes a ton of power, but I'm sure having solar panels and just pumping that into a battery would be much cheaper and more straightforward process into an electric vehicle than it would be to take all this power, make the fuel, get it into truck it or transport it into this Porsche with a combustion engine somewhere, have it burn it, go up in the atmosphere and suck it back out and do it all over again. So I like the idea. I think that for aviation, it's super important because planes can't carry the weight and battery. Like, it's just not going to work. You need to have high energy dense fuel way to use that energy efficiently. Well, relatively efficiently.
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure we're not looking at environmental red herrings here, where we're moving the emissions from what comes out the tailpipe to just sort of gently out of public view, where it's now being the emissions are just in producing the fuel in the first place. Now, granted, Porsche are working around this, I think, with wind energy and maybe solar as well. I mean, there's obviously the solutions here. I'm not sort of here to say whether it's right or wrong, but I think you're right. It has to make sense in the overall scheme as well.
I love the idea of having sustainable fuel. I don't think that battery technology is at the point where it can take over everything. And I also don't think we would want it to. I think that we all want to have a fun weekend car or race car or whatever that we can enjoy. And if we can do that, even if it costs 2 or 3 times for the fuel, but it's sustainable like that, you're not hurting anyone, then I would be happy to pay that difference. If I'm going to the racetrack and it costs me another $200 in fuel for the weekend, that's fine. I'll deal with that to be able to feel a bit better about my.
Yeah, I've been through that as well. Not necessarily with a fuel that was any environmentally better, but I mean, in my drag racing days, we were running on VP Q16, C16, or VP import fuels, which were multiples of what we'd pay for pump gas. Granted, we were doing this for performance reasons, but the precedent has been set. I've proven that I am prepared to pay what is an exorbitant amount of money for fuel in order to go and do the things that I love doing. So that's probably not going to change anytime in the near future.
Yeah, so maybe there can be a high performance synthetic fuel. I mean, ethanol is more sustainable, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, you then get the argument that the ethanol production is taking up farmland that could be used for food crops, and then all of the other negatives. I mean, there's always two sides to the coin. I'm not here to kind of get bogged down in a debate on it. Yeah, and it's outside of the scope of our podcast. We're not here to be negative about it. Yes, I know there's pros and cons with all of these technologies. We're just here to kind of report on the state of the technology and where it's headed. Now, also, we've kind of seen, coming back to the current EV market, we've sort of seen, I guess, like almost an arms race between the different manufacturers trying to one-up each other on who's going to be the fastest, the most powerful, the quickest 0 to 60. I think we're under 2 seconds now, which is just mind-blowing. Quarter mile times that are almost in line with what my drag car was doing back in the day, and now we're talking about cars with a full interior, air conditioning, full leather that you can also drive, 400 or 500 kilometers of range. These are insane numbers. So my question here is, where's the limitation? Where does this all stop? I mean, are we going to just get to a point where now they're going to have to develop better and better tire compounds in order to get this torque from the electric motor to the asphalt?
I don't know. I don't know when it stops, but I would say yes, the tire technology is quickly becoming the limiting factor for 400 meters or quarter mile. One thing that's been really interesting is how there's been a lot of new companies that have been making really wild vehicles like Lucid and Tesla and Rivian. But the Porsche is kind of the exception. Other than Porsche, there haven't been a lot of these traditional manufacturers that have come out and had anything that is, earth shattering. And I think that shows how far behind they kind of are on this technology. So to me, that's the biggest thing I always see. There's a new one that just did the Nürburgring. Can't remember. I don't even know how to pronounce it. I think it's a cell phone company.
Oh, is that the one that took the four-door production car record around the
A
Nürburgring?
couple of days ago, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually saw that, I think, this morning, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was like a 645 or something like this. So yeah, I find that to be super interesting and impressive. And to me, it really just shows that there's going to potentially be a big shift in the market share of the automotive space. Like the more the EV market grows, I think you can say that goes hand in hand with the more the traditional car companies decline. So whereas if we keep internal combustion engines, those manufacturers maybe have a better shot. So it's just interesting to see that. And whenever I see these lap records and these crazy 0 to 60 times and power numbers, it's usually a new startup company or a small company that hasn't been around for long. They make their own motors, they make their own batteries, they have their own electronics, totally in house. So yeah.
On face value, that seems like an incredibly risky prospect. I've talked to a few guys who have been involved with EV startups that maybe haven't gone the distance, and the resounding sort of comment I get back is making cars is really, really hard.
I think that RJ from Rivian said a really funny thing. I just watched a YouTube video and he said, "You spend $3 billion before you make your first dollar." Can you imagine being in a boardroom being like, yes, I'm going to put down $3 billion before I make any money back?
It's hard to get excited about that level of investment.
You have to be insane. So it's crazy. And, I'm thankful they're doing it.
You definitely need a very, very well tuned crystal ball to have the confidence to know that that's going to make sense, because it's also the lead time on this investment. I mean,
You can't know. Like, for example, Rivian got killed by COVID and all the supply chain things that almost killed them. They couldn't have projected that was going to happen.
no, you can't predict a black swan event like that. But yeah, and Rivian, I remember hearing about Rivian. I can't remember. It must have been 5+ years before they were actually starting to ship trucks. Would that sound about right?
Yeah, yeah. I put my deposit down in 2018 and I got my truck when they released it. So that was 5 years. It was 2023, 2024.
It's actually quite interesting being here in Queenstown. It doesn't happen very often, but half an hour away from us, 45 minutes away from us, is a testing facility called the Southern Hemisphere Proving Grounds. And basically, it's a sort of a snow and an ice facility that a lot of the European manufacturers will ship cars over here, and well, European and North American, and use for testing and development over our winter. And you'll see a flock of Teslas, fleet, whatever you call them.
But Andre, the Earth's flat, so how does that work?
Don't get me started on that. So you'd see some model that doesn't exist yet, and it'll be left-hand drive with sort of test plates on it. And driving through our local sort of mall car park. It would have been a couple of years ago, well before they were ever released. And here's a couple of Rivians parked up, all in camouflage sort of wraps. And sort of raises an eyebrow. So, oh yeah, actually, they're a pretty cool. They're a pretty cool truck.
Yep, I really like them.
I don't know if I can get my head around the headlights, if I was honest, but that's definitely a personal preference thing.
For sure, for sure.
All right, so that's kind of our sort of catch up to speed on the state of EV, and why we wanted to get you back on the podcast, of course, is that we partnered recently on our EV fundamentals course. This is something that HPA had been asked for probably for the last 5 or so years, both from enthusiasts as well as some of the electronics manufacturers who are starting to support this sort of nascent industry. And who better to get to front that course than someone who's actually lived through it, knows the technology inside and out. And I just wanted to sort of, for the sake of those listening, talk a little bit about this course. I'm not trying to turn it into a big old sales pitch. This is of interest to those who want to learn more about EVs, and I absolutely know that it's not going to be for everyone. But it's been difficult, as with any quickly advancing technology, to find a one single place to go and learn everything you need to learn about EV electric vehicles, particularly if you're starting to look at the options of maybe building your own home-built EV conversion. I want to also say what this course is and what it isn't. There's a hint in the name. It is the fundamentals course, so it covers the fundamentals of how all of the components work individually and then how they work together. This isn't a practical how to EV swap your whatever you may have, and that's a course that if we have enough demand, we will bring out.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I remember vividly the first time I opened the hood of a car, and I was pretty late getting into cars. I wasn't brought into it by my parents or anything. And I opened the hood and I was like, I don't know what any of these things are. Like, not a single thing. Okay, that's a battery. I know that you jumpstart it there. And that's kind of what the course is. The course is when you look at an EV and all of this stuff is brand new, we're explaining exactly how the architecture and the systems of this vehicle work and how EVs in general work, why they work this way, what the limitations are, so that when you go to do a project, you have that foundation. Because otherwise, your first build or your first project, you don't want to learn those lessons with dollars and hours and make mistakes on your project. So I think we felt it was important to, like, this isn't just a different type of engine. This isn't just a different type of differential. Like, the whole vehicle, it's like opening the hood for the first time again and you don't know what any of the stuff is. So I think that's why it made sense to kind of have this fundamentals course of the whole architecture of an EV.
Yeah, I mean, I liken it back to, I guess, High Performance Academy now, we're sort of 12 plus years deep on creating training courses. So I like to think that over that time, we've kind of figured out a few key aspects that make our courses work and make them easy to understand. And what we want to always do with a course is basically give all of the knowledge we need to understand to do a certain task without sort of sugarcoating it with all the bullshit that exists but maybe isn't really that necessary. And if I liken this back to our EFI tuning courses, we started out exactly the same way. We've got our EFI tuning fundamentals, and that does what it says on the label. It teaches you the fundamentals of how an internal combustion engine works, how an electronic fuel injection system works, how the engine responds to fuel, how the engine responds to ignition timing. Now, for a lot of people taking that course who are pretty switched on, they'll probably come out of that course with enough cues to be able to sort of fiddle around and start tuning an engine and get results. But it isn't a practical application of that knowledge. For that, we do have our 2 practical tuning courses, and they sort of build on that knowledge from the fundamentals and then show you how to apply it in a step-by-step way. And I think in general, we've applied that across all of the areas we teach, and it's worked exceptionally well. So, as I say, with enough demand, and we are already seeing a lot of questions about when the next course is coming out, we'll probably look into a practical EV swap course, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that may look like shortly. But for a start, I just want to kind of cover some of what we go over in the EV fundamentals course and just sort of get a high level view of it. So for a start, if we look at the EV basics, for example, in that section of the course, we sort of cover the electric basics, upgrade limitations, and some of the EV conversion basics. Again, sort of just in a minute or two, could you give us your sort of high level view on those topics?
Yeah, I mean, sure, it's been a little bit since I've gone through it, so you'll have to forgive me. But when you come into EVs, one of the first questions people always ask is, why can't I make more power?
Yes. Me included, actually.
That's the first question everyone asks. Why can't it make more power? The second question is, why does it overheat? So also, it's a little bit of explaining the differences between how an internal combustion engine works, where there's all these different variables that internal combustion engine has to deal with, different qualities of gasoline, different atmosphere, different temperatures, whereas an EV is really in a pretty consistent environment. As long as it's got the voltage and it's at a certain temperature, those are pretty much the variables. So the manufacturers can tune the EVs for short periods of time to give you a ton of power. We want that 0 to 60 time. We'll give you 600 or 700 horsepower, whatever the number is, for 10 seconds so that we can sell a car that has this 0 to 60 time. But as we all know, with electronics, there's a resistance in the circuit. And if you can put more current through for a short period of time, and the circuit will start getting hotter. So you can't do that indefinitely because the circuit will get too hot. And that's fundamentally what this introduction kind of explains is in terms of the upgrade limitations, is this is why you can't just add more power, and this is why the vehicles overheat. And it's totally different.
Yeah. I think for those who are, coming into this completely fresh, there's an expectation that, yes, we know thermal management is very important for internal combustion engines, and on face value, not knowing anything, we might sort of overlook the fact that it's actually just as critical for electric vehicles.
Yeah, unfortunately with electric vehicles, it's more challenging because if you're dealing with an OEM vehicle, for example, there's a number of modeled systems that aren't using actual temperature measurements. So whatever component is overheating, even if you cool that component, you can't fix the problem because it's hard coded into the drive unit or the battery management system. So there are these challenges where without the ability to rewrite software in these controllers, you can't cool them. Like even if you could cool them, it's not having an effect on the output of the vehicle.
So just to elaborate on this, OE manufacturers don't like putting sensors in vehicles because they cost money, and when you multiply the cost of the sensor by maybe 100,000 vehicles, that starts to become a substantial cost. So instead of directly measuring, they are using sophisticated algorithms to always sort of calculate what the temperature is likely to be, and then basing their control or safety strategies around that predicted temperature as opposed to the actual temperature. So you're saying there, if you fix the actual temperature, the controller doesn't know, it's still calculating it to be much hotter than it is, so you don't actually get the improvement in performance.
And with electric vehicles, it's much easier to model because, like I said, there's fewer variables. So there's a lot of that modeling happening. And this is where, if you have an EV conversion and you've got your own inverter and your own BMS and you're in control of everything, then, okay, this is a different story. And you can really start pushing things and getting right to the limits. But if you're talking about an OEM vehicle or an EV conversion that's using OEM controlled components, then these are the limitations that we don't currently have a way to break through.
Okay, so that's definitely a problem. We'll cover a little bit more of some of the aftermarket options available as we go. So in terms of, again, just our comparison with internal combustion engines, basically what we're saying here is that with the huge range of variables that exist in terms of fuel quality, atmospheric conditions, whereabouts in the world the car is going to be operating, it's imperative that the factory calibration allows for this. So really there's a big old chunk of safety factor built into the calibration, and in the aftermarket we can calibrate more specifically for the fuel the car's running on and the conditions it's operating in. And it's very rare if we couldn't see maybe something like a 10% improvement in power and torque with no hardware modifications. That is unrealistic for an electric vehicle.
In a sense, it's certainly possible that you could get 10% more torque, but for less time if you could control. So yeah, I mean, the answer is yes.
Yeah, basically, there isn't that headroom in the calibration that we see with internal combustion. Now, the next thing you mentioned there, that it's possible to produce this high level of power and torque for brief periods of time before the temperature starts to run away. So we might get 10 seconds of 700 horsepower, enough to lay down like a really fast quarter mile time or something. So I guess the part that's not really put into the marketing materials is what actually happens once we sort of get to that maximum temperature and the controller starts derating everything. How much would we likely expect to drop off in terms of power and torque?
Every vehicle is different. It really comes down to controlling whatever component is overheating. So OEMs don't like to spend a bunch of money on connectors that are oversized than they need to be. So something as simple as a connector coming off of the battery could be rated only for 300 amps, but it draws 1200 amps when it's doing a quarter mile run.
Yeah.
And so it limits you, and it'll drop you right down to 300 amps if you run for long enough. So you could lose 75% of your power over 20 minutes. For example, the Model S Plaid, I was just looking through a car that was doing 25-minute races, and a component overheated after I think 25 minutes and dropped him down to like 100 horsepower or something like this.
Wow, that's going to be pretty disappointing.
It's just not cooling down anymore. Like you had 700 horsepower for 10 minutes, then 600, then 500, then 400, but it won't actively start cooling back down until it's just air cooled component. So the model basically sees that the environment around it is the same temperature as the component at this point. It will not cool down. Like you need to stop the vehicle.
So that's another point here. So when we sort of think about controlling temperature in an internal combustion engine, we've got quite a significant temperature gradient between ambient and maybe the engine coolant. I'll talk in degrees C here because we're metric, but maybe the ambient temperature is 20 degrees C and the coolant temperature through the radiators maybe 90 or 95 degrees C. That's a big thermal gradient which helps with that cooling. Not quite that easy with the EV components though, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and that's why most EVs now have a compressor. So because the temperature, sometimes maybe you're in the hottest parts in the United States, the temperature gradient might be 0 or 5 degrees. You might be in 55 or 60 degrees temperature on the asphalt, the air off the asphalt that's coming off the radiator, coming to the radiator. And the battery wants to be cooling itself down for a supercharger stop. It wants to be at 40 degrees Celsius. So you've got a negative 20 degree, like you can't cool it. So that's why there's a compressor, and it's like an air conditioning system in your house. And it will have the ability to do a larger amount of cooling or heating with a inverse or smaller temperature gradient.
Okay. Talk to us about the importance of managing that battery temperature for the likes of charging, as you kind of just alluded to there. What do we need to know about that?
Yeah, I think understanding the way a battery works, what its limitations are, and how it changes based on temperature and based on how you use it over years or months, it's kind of interesting. A battery is almost like a living thing, and the better you take care of it, the longer it will last, and the more you abuse it, the more risky it is, and then the chance that you'll have to permanently damage it. So when you supercharge or fast charge a battery, it creates like there's more heat created more quickly in the battery. And so most EVs will pre-cool or preheat the battery to a target temperature when it goes to charge. And every manufacturer does this a little bit differently. So Tesla, for example, is quite confident in their chemistry and the cooling system that they can preheat the battery up to say 55 degrees Celsius and supercharge at that temperature, which means they're confident that the temperature won't rise while they're charging. They'll be able to maintain it with a cooling system, even while it's being charged very rapidly. And two, that the battery chemistry that they have is okay with being charged rapidly at that high temperature. And then you take another vehicle and it'll actively pre-cool and try and get the battery down to say 35 degrees Celsius so that when it gets to the charger, the cooling system cannot keep up. So it knows by the end of the charging, it will raise it will rise to say 50 or 55. So that's a different strategy that's being done because the cooling system can't keep up, for example. Or maybe the chemistry of the cell is going to have higher rates of wear if it's charging quickly at 50 or 60 degrees Celsius. So they want to start lower.
I just wanted to interrupt our chat with Sasha and talk about a relatively new course that's going to be perfect if you're enjoying our chat so far. And that, of course, is our electric vehicle fundamentals course, normally valued at $199 US. You can use the coupon code ONPOINT50, and that will get you $50 off, bringing it down to just $149 US. So far, traditionally, it has been reasonably difficult to learn a lot about EVs, and particularly if we're going to go ahead and perform our own EV swap, what we need to do and how we need to go about this. This course is here to really break down some of those misunderstandings and give you all of the information you need about how an electric vehicle operates. We start with EV basics, which includes electric basics, upgrade limitations, EV conversion basics, and the sorts of things that are going to absolutely destroy your range with an electric vehicle. We then move into EV motors specifically, and we talk about the concepts of how these motors work, the different motor types, and the limitations and cooling. Hand in hand with the motor itself, of course, is the inverter, and we talk about the purpose of an inverter, the control systems, field weakening, and inverter limitations and cooling. Next, we move into batteries, which really make up the third key part of an electric vehicle. We talk about the battery module itself, battery packs, the battery management system, battery dynamics, and what can damage a battery. There's also some auxiliary devices we're going to find in electric vehicles, such as our vehicle control unit, the DC-DC converter, and the onboard charger. Speaking of charging, we do talk about EV charging and how this works itself. We also cover the thermal system with EVs, including cooling and heating, heat pumps, battery cooling, and plumbing system architecture. We also cover a couple of case studies that Sasha himself has been involved with, including his Blue Lightning Lotus Evora, which is Tesla swapped, as well as his Nissan 350Z, which we've covered within this particular podcast with his hybrid system. And remember, that entire course, normally $199 US, using that coupon code ONPOINT50, you'll find that coupon code in the show notes, brings it down to just $149 US. You can still use our payment plan and break that down into as many as 8 individual weekly payments to make it as affordable as we can make it. You also are protected by our normal 60-day, no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase using that coupon code and still just don't feel it's right for you, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. Let's get back to our chat with Sasha now. A little off topic, but just because we're talking about batteries and supercharging there, you hear all sorts of kind of conflicting views on how best to maintain the likes of your cell phone battery. Never completely discharge it before you plug it in and charge it. And just as many people will say, make sure you completely discharge the battery before plugging it in. So two completely conflicting views there. Just my gut feel would say that high-speed supercharging would potentially be more damaging to your battery than a overnight slow charger that's maybe going to take 6 or 8 hours to achieve the same aim. Am I completely off the mark there? Is there anything we do need to know how best to keep the battery alive for as long as possible?
Yeah, so what seems to be the general rule of thumb that I think most people don't disagree with is keeping the battery at a high state of charge, like 100%, for a long period of time, especially when the battery's hot, is the best way to do permanent damage to the battery. So, for example, supercharging it to 100% and then leaving it parked outside in the Arizona sun for months on end. That will definitely severely damage the battery. If you're supercharging the vehicle from 20% to 80% and you're doing that regularly, surprisingly with Tesla vehicles anyways, they have shown a really strong, they'll lose about 10% of the capacity and then that'll hold for quite a long period of time. So it's hard to generalize too much because every chemistry is different, but generally speaking, the slower you charge the battery, the nicer it is on it. And the closer you stay to 50% state of charge, the happier the battery is. So if you're going to leave your car for 6 months, usually you leave it at 50%, and that's kind of the best place for it, 50 to 60%.
I think that's a great tip. It definitely wouldn't. I would have thought leaving it fully charged would have probably been the smart option. So shame on me, I guess. And fair play as well. Obviously, you can't generalize here because, as you mentioned, every manufacturer is going to be somewhat different. All right, let's move on. And we've got sections in the course that cover in-depth EV motors and then EV inverters. And we could probably dedicate a podcast to each of those topics. They tend to go hand in hand, but I think this is an area, particularly the inverter and what the inverter does. This is an area of mystery, I guess, for, again, those who don't have an electronics degree and are fresh to this technology coming from internal combustion. Again, can you give us maybe the cliff notes on what we need to know about EV motors and the inverter?
Yeah, I like electronics. I'm not an electronics engineer or an expert in how inverter control or motor design is done, but I love inverters. I think they're so cool. Just trying to think in my head about the waveforms and the way that they're just kind of always pulling or absorbing from the motor. It's cool because they can just instantly apply and remove torque so fast, so precisely. I can't remember exactly what I was doing, but I set up an inverter and I set the slew rate, basically how quickly I ask for the torque to go from 0 to whatever value. So how quickly I ask for the torque to change. And it sounded, I swear to God, like someone took a sledgehammer and hit the housing of the motor. It was so violent and powerful. And you're like, how can a magnetic field do that? But yeah, so they're really super cool. And so basically what an inverter does is it takes in the DC voltage from the battery and it applies it to the motor, and it's always perfectly synchronized, just like almost like ignition timing on an engine. It's always just staying in that optimal position and pulling or pushing on that motor to work on it in the most efficient way. And so the amplitude of that will increase when you want more torque, so you'll put more current through. And yeah, that precision and that control is really interesting, especially even with sequential gearbox and the hybrid system, and it's able to just keep up and do that. So there's all kinds of different layouts and designs of motors, and they have all kinds of different limitations. But fundamentally, what you need to know is that when you've got more voltage, you can get away with a lighter motor and a lighter inverter. Everything can be lighter and smaller when you work at a higher voltage. So kind of the goal and the reason that a lot of OEMs are switching from 400 volts to 800 volts is you need half the current, and that produces a lot less heat, and you can make the components much smaller. As well, RPM. The more RPM you have, same thing. You need less torque, so everything can be smaller to make the same power. So yeah, I mean that's kind of just touching the surface of it. But basically, inverters and the way inverters can precisely and smoothly work with motors is what makes EVs possible. It's not like an industrial motor you have in your business where you turn it on and the lights dim and it slowly ramps up to that 60 hertz or whatever frequency your grid runs at, and then it kind of just runs at that speed, exactly at the speed of the motor at any given state and at any torque. So
Okay. Difficult concept to explain without the benefit of some nice animations. So I think you've done a stand-up job there. But essentially what it's doing is creating this magnetic field, and it's moving that magnetic field around as the motor turns to always keep it in an optimal place to accelerate or control the engine, the motor's torque or movement, correct?
Exactly. Yep. One way to go forward and another way to absorb power back into the battery.
Yeah. So a part of this, though, is, as you've mentioned, there's a variety of configurations of motor. All of the electric motor designers kind of have their own take on things. So there's an element of characterization between the inverter and the electric motor, correct? So we can't just take a Tesla drive unit and, couple it with something from a different manufacturer. They have to actually be matched or characterized together.
Exactly. That's like the unfortunate truth. It would kind of be like taking the ECU out of one car and just plugging it into another engine and expecting it just to work. You have different types of sensors and they need to be calibrated for, and you also have different types of motors, so they want that magnetic field to be in a different position. It's not always exactly the same for every motor type.
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave that there because, again, as I mentioned, we could probably dedicate the whole podcast to just that. We'll move on. One of the next sections covers batteries, and I think we've kind of done batteries in a reasonable amount of detail already. The couple of things that I did want to cover here, the BMS or battery management system, what is that and what does that do? And I think you've kind of covered some of this already, but maybe just put a nice little bow around it for us.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the most basic job of the BMS is a battery is made up of a number of cells that are stacked up in series. So if you take, I think if you've worked with electronics and you've put a bunch of batteries together in parallel, we all kind of know that when you connect them in parallel, they just all have the same voltage. They're all just connected to each other. But when you connect batteries in series, which means positive to negative, and so on and so forth, there's no way for those battery cells to naturally all make sure they're at the same voltage as each other. So the fundamental job of the BMS is to control the battery, make sure it's safe, but also to monitor the voltage of each individual cell. So a normal EV will have 96 to as many as 100 and 190 cells in series, and it will monitor the voltage of each of those cells and make sure that the high ones get bled down so that they all kind of stay the same. Because what would happen is if one cell got really high or one cell got really low, you can only charge up once the highest cell gets to its limit. That's where you've got to stop. Even if the rest of them are at 80%, you've got to stop there when the top one's at 100. And likewise, when you're going down, if the bottom one gets down to 0%, but the majority are at 10 or 20%, you've got to stop there. So the BMS's job is to keep the cells balanced for the health of the battery and also the capacity of the battery and the usable capacity of it.
Okay. As you're explaining that's sounding to me like very similar to the relationship between the electric motor and the inverter, that the BMS is going to be designed around a specific battery pack. Am I correct there, or is this a bit more universal?
Yep, you're correct. A BMS has all kinds of other jobs. It controls the contactors, which are these big switches that connect and disconnect the battery from the rest of the high voltage system. And so it's the same thing. It's again like unplugging an ECU and putting it into a totally different wiring harness and hoping it will work. The ways that the BMS communicates with the individual battery modules is a proprietary communications network, and it will not just work. So when you're talking about using OEM components, you would need to use an OEM BMS with the OEM modules.
Yep. Okay, perfect. All right. I think as well, when we talk about batteries, there's always the sort of unhinged fear of electric vehicles burning to the ground. And yes, granted, that there have been examples of this. I think it's put a lot of fear into the motorsport community. I think I was talking to someone in Australia, basically at the moment, their body that covers motorsport won't allow for electric vehicles to compete because of that. I mean, I'd wager at this point, a factor of maybe 100 to 1 internal combustion engines have burnt to the ground compared to EV, but obviously that's not really a fair argument because EVs are much newer. But how realistic is this fear? How much should we be concerned about it?
The problem with when EVs light on fire, they're very difficult to put out, almost impossible to put out the fire. That's the fundamental challenge. They don't catch on fire very often. I mean, we have a Model 3 racing series, and we're regularly, guys are crashing over curbs and even sometimes crashing into tire walls. And there's been many of incidents, and there's never been a fire. The batteries are well designed. Most of these batteries that are sold today pass things like a puncture test where they'll put a nail through the battery and have to ensure that it won't light on fire. So fires can occur, don't get me wrong, and the electrolyte in a battery is flammable. So once one battery cell catches on fire and it propagates, the entire battery is going to want to go up in fire. But it's just very rare. So what most racetracks are doing now is just kind of having an emergency plan. I should preface this by saying usually when an EV battery fire starts, it starts in a very slow and controlled way. So you'll usually have some smoke, and then usually there's minutes, 10, 30 minutes until an actual fire breaks out. So management technique is to have a safe spot somewhere where the vehicle can be towed and left there that doesn't ruin the rest of the day, the activities of that track race weekend or
So we can kind of send the next session out to compete while the Tesla gently burns in the corner.
exactly get your marshmallows and go over there and have some toxic marshmallows.
Toxic marshmallows.
Yeah, I don't mean to I don't mean to joke about it, but I haven't yet seen a fire happen at the racetrack, but that is the way to manage it. Insurance companies love to make any new challenge into something that's really big and impossible and expensive. But the reality is that EV fires, I think, from an occupant standpoint, are safer than internal combustion engine fires because they tend to happen slowly. So you have plenty of time for service workers or rescue workers to get to the vehicle, pull the driver out before the fire propagates past the firewall and into the cabin. So at that point, it's just a matter of figuring out how to get the vehicle out of the way so you can keep running the event.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I think that's really good to know that it is actually quite a slow process there. I can't remember how much accuracy there is in this, but I think when I was talking about this sort of the direction they were going in Australia with motorsport, it might have even been as far as they needed like a 20-foot container pool that they could put the car in. I don't know, that seemed a little bit overkill to me.
That's a bit excessive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then also like if you start seeing a little whiff of smoke, is that the time that you drive your potentially absolutely perfectly fine car into a swimming pool, only to find out that that wasn't the issue? I don't know how we deal with it.
Well, by the time you put it in the pool, it would have been the issue because now now everything's going to be short circuited. But yeah, just having a having
Definitely.
a sand trap somewhere, for example, you don't have to submerge the vehicle in liquid. It just needs to be far enough away from people to be safe. So if it wasn't going to catch on fire, it can just sit there for a few hours.
The other thing, you've kind of alluded to this already, but the thermal management side of things, I'm assuming all going to plan there, the battery is not going to catch fire without some external force, maybe an impact or a puncture as a result of an accident, or are there other conditions aside from crash damage that can result in a battery fire?
Yeah, I mean, certainly anything that results in a short circuit could potentially lead to a fire. So if you had some sort of manufacturing defect or something like this that happened inside the battery while it was on the racetrack, that could conceivably happen. I haven't yet seen that in an OEM built vehicle on the racetrack. You do see some reports of some vehicles that caught on fire while charging. So this could be because they had software problems and they were overcharged and the charging just didn't stop. They never tell you what happened, right? They just say there was a fire. So we don't know why those fires occurred. But in terms of a fire happening to a vehicle that's running on the track, I can't say that I've seen that happen before.
Okay. Yeah, good to know. And I think, again, it's sort of played into a bit of fear-mongering that you take your EV on the racetrack and chances are it's going to catch fire, which obviously is ridiculous and absolutely not the case. But yes, at the same time,
I mean, if it's a road car like an OEM EV that you've purchased from a manufacturer, that's ridiculous. They wouldn't be allowed to sell them
as you would hope.
if an operator could make them catch on fire.
Now, there's a bunch more in the course that I won't kind of cover in detail here, such as the charging system, cabling and the wiring design, and then we've already talked to a degree about the thermal system, thermal management. What was really interesting to me is to add a bit of a practical element to the course. We do cover two case studies, which are your Blue Lightning Lotus Evora, which I think you swapped a Tesla, was it a Model 3 drive unit into?
Model S.
Model S, sorry. Yep, I think the Model 3 maybe wasn't even around then, was it?
Yeah, it wasn't. Not in Canada.
Yeah, okay. Model S, and then also the 350Z with the hybrid system, which we've talked about to a degree today. Now, moving on from this, as we've already sort of discussed, the next obvious step, if we go further with this and the demand is there, is sort of something around a practical EV swap course, because that's kind of, I think, what a lot of people have on their minds. As these cars get faster and more common, unfortunately, the statistics just show that probably more people are going to punt them into fences and they're going to end up in breakers' yards, which is great because we get access to all of these high spec OE components, which we can then potentially repurpose for an EV swap. Now, again, we could spend hours on this, but if we can go through maybe at a high level view, let's say I've got an old Mazda MX-5, Mazda Miata, and it's got a dead internal combustion engine, and I'm thinking that this might make a pretty good base for an EV conversion. Clean sheet of paper, I don't own any componentry yet. From your experience, how would you advise me to move forward with this project?
Yeah, that's always a challenge because the industry is so young that you have to do your research when it comes to picking components. So when it comes to controlling OEM motors and batteries and things like this, there's a lot of people out there that say they can get them to work, but you have to understand exactly what that means. How will they work? What kind of control will I have of it? And can I find a group of people that have done this and reliably, and is what this person's saying true? So that would be my first step is pick a motor that meets the power level that you want, that's supported, that someone has figured out how to make controllable in a non-OEM application. So whether that's with a separate control board that they sell you or whether that's with a different inverter, but you really have to do your research when you're picking your components to make sure that what you're buying will work because
So you could get yourself into a situation where you've bought an electric motor and maybe an inverter, but you've just wasted a whole bunch of money on something that you've got no way of controlling outside of that OE vehicle in its entirety.
yes, we've seen this a few times. We've had a number of customers that said, I bought this motor and I bought this and I put it in and here's pictures of it installed. We say, okay, but how are you going to control it? Like, what are you using to control this OEM motor? Oh, I don't know. This guy said he can do this or whatever. And then that's what we hate to see because people end up spending good money over bad. So the first thing is really do your research. The industry is so new. This is not like buying an LS and dropping it in and you have 100 different ECU options.
Could I liken this maybe back to the earlier days of direct injected engine technology where the aftermarket ECUs hadn't caught up? I mean, yeah, you could buy the engine from a wrecker, you could work on getting it fitted to your vehicle, and that's all easy enough. But then how are you going to actually operate that engine? Because without the correct ECU with the ability to control direct injection and the mechanical, let's say the direct injection high pressure fuel pump, yeah, you're dead in the water.
Exactly. So that's the most important thing is pick your motor inverter combination that you know will work. Once you do that, the next biggest challenge is the battery. So you want to put 30 kilowatt hours, 50 kilowatt hours in this MX5, and that's a small vehicle. So you need to plan out which battery modules you're going to use and how you're going to package them safely, or whether you're okay with them being exposed to the elements and taking your risks, which a lot of EV conversion people do. I don't think that that's the way to go. I think that you should have the battery enclosed in some type of aluminum or carbon fiber enclosure and then pick the BMS that you're going to use to work with it. There's aftermarket options, there's OEM options that work with different controllers. But again, it's all very new, and you have to make sure that you pick a partner that's done this before and has proven success so that you're not a guinea pig or starting on something that's going to be a failed project. Once you've got those things sorted out, the other components like the charger and the DC-DC and those things, that's more of a smoother process because you can use affordable aftermarket products that are easy to integrate.
Okay. Let's come back one or two steps here and talk about some of the more fundamental aspects of just the mechanical design. So electric motors don't generally run a gearbox like we do with an internal combustion engine. They're generally sort of a direct drive sort of system. So if we look at our MX-5, how would we go about packaging an electric motor into that vehicle? Would we fit it essentially in the front where the internal combustion engine was? Obviously, we don't need the gearbox as just explained. Will we then just run a prop shaft back to the differential? That in itself I could see causing some issues with our diff ratio. Or would we basically remove the complete rear subframe and fit the electric motor sort of almost direct drive at the rear of the vehicle? What's the take on that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So if you put the motor in direct into the final drive, so you have motor mounted in the engine bay, prop shaft to the diff, that is not going to work with most motors because most motors run at around an 8 to 10 to 1 reduction. So your diff is probably about 4 to 1. So some people that do EV conversions will put the motor into the transmission and leave it in a fixed gear. This is the heaviest way to do it, the least efficient way to do it, and your MX-5 now has no space to put batteries anywhere.
Yeah.
Certainly, the best thing to do is to remove the subframe, get a drive unit, and get a fabricator to make that drive unit. When I say drive unit, it's an inverter, a motor, and a gear reduction all in one, and looks like a transverse.
So it's basically ready to come out of essentially a differential with half shafts to each side of the car.
Exactly. Yep. So you put that in place, and the only connections to that drive unit usually will be water lines for the cooling and two DC high voltage cables and the low voltage controls. So, you can pull a drive unit out and in. They're very simple in terms of their connections. But the fabrication side, I mean, in an MX-5, you're probably cutting out the trunk and making space. The drive unit is much bigger than the differential was.
Yeah. So it's going to take out most of the rear of the car.
Yeah, it's probably wider than the suspension pickup points, so you might end up having issues with that. So this is really where understanding the vehicle, usually have a 3D scan if you're able to work with those types of things, to take a model of the drive unit and just physically put it into that 3D space and does it fit? Should we even start with this or take some pictures and measurements? I mean, you picked the worst vehicle to start with, I would say, and an X5 there's just not a lot of real estate for the.
No, it's a small car.
Exactly. So a lot of people, for example, have taken the entire subframe out of a Model S and grafted that into other vehicles because they keep all. It's easier for them to make the 4 points for the subframe swap over on a Supra, for example, than it would be to put the drive unit in a Supra's rear subframe and have to remake everything. So in the case with our Lotus, we kept the subframe of the Evora and the suspension were able to fit the motor, but many other cars, it might be, for example, you could take a Model 3 subframe and maybe you can graft that into your MX-5 and have a Model 3 rear end in your MX-5 and really wide over fenders.
Let's sort of just say that this is obviously a hypothetical build. So for the moment, let's forget that I've chosen the worst possible car to try and electrify, and we'll just assume that we've scaled the MX-5 up by, let's say, 35%. So now the fitment is no longer an issue. But you've mentioned that it's really important for us to know what we're dealing with and make sure that we're choosing a motor and inverter that we can control. At the current state of play, if I said, hey, this is the project I've got in mind, and let's say I want 400 to 500 horsepower, is there anything or any options that you would straight away sort of name off the top of your head that you know would suit that kind of target?
Yeah, the Model S motor is kind of the go-to in terms of high power, low runtime. A number of people have them. There's a number of different controllers out there that can at least get you up and running in an OEM type environment. Like, for example, our Lotus uses the factory Tesla control board, and it effectively only has a pedal input for torque requests. So everything we want to do, we manipulate through that pedal input. Now, if you had an unlimited budget, you would go and buy a different drive unit from an aftermarket company that gives you the DBC and you communicate over CAN and you make those torque requests. And that's, a different level. That's more of a tier one or higher budget type of project. But then this way you're now not kind of working around the OEM systems, you're directly controlling the components. My hope is that in the future, we'll be able to directly control these OEM components so that we kind of have the best of both worlds.
When you're sort of talking about some of these aftermarket component manufacturers for motors and inverters, you go walk around SEMA and you'll probably see a few options there, which all look really appealing. They're nice and shiny. They make heaps of power, but there's a significant financial barrier to entry compared to going to a wrecker and buying a crash Model S, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. About 10x.
Yeah, so that's what you say. It's a tier one. It's not for the home enthusiast to be starting to look at these aftermarket components at this stage, unless you're incredibly well funded.
Right. And I believe in the future, what's going to come will be drive units that are similar to what we find in a Model 3 or these types of vehicles, but an aftermarket version. Because as the technology becomes more affordable, someone will find a way to bring in a complete drive unit that isn't from an OEM and that has a DBC or the outline of how to control it, so to speak.
You've used that term DBC twice now for those who don't speak that language. Can you just explain what that term means and the importance of it?
Yes, sorry. A DBC is basically just like translation program for how to translate the messages, the CAN bus messages, to interface with that component. So it's kind of like a dictionary or whatnot that you can use to, I guess, the universal language for CAN.
So, for example, once you have that DBC file, you know what the format of a CAN message for a torque request needs to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Just wanted to clear that up. Now, if we go back to using the Tesla drive unit, and as you mentioned there, you're sort of stuck at the moment with the Tesla control. What are the downsides of that as opposed to having complete direct control like we would with some of these aftermarket units with the supplied DVC?
Sure. So the main drawbacks are you have to work within the same voltage range. So if you want to build a higher voltage spec vehicle, but the drive unit is designed for 400 volts only, and if you build a battery pack that's 450 volts, you can't push the limits and force the system to run the motor at that higher voltage and run the inverter at that higher voltage. So you have to work within the voltage range that that drive unit is designed for, and you cannot manipulate the power beyond the power that the drive unit can make, even for short periods of time, and you cannot operate it beyond its modeled or real temperature limits. So even if you put in really big conductors and you add all this special cooling, if it's got a model in there that says, I'm going to overheat after this much runtime, you're stuck with that.
So this kind of is what you were talking about earlier, as these problems with the model temperature, thermal management.
Right. If it's got a really lazy, slow slew rate, so like when you press the pedal, if it takes a second before it's really giving you full torque, you're stuck with that. If you want to have a fancy traction control system and you're interfacing through this slow throttle pedal input, even if you made something really fancy to manipulate that signal, you wouldn't be able to have good control. So if you just want to drive the car around, or you're just doing a conversion for yourself to enjoy, and it's not a high performance racing vehicle, and you're not trying to push the limits, then that's probably fine. But there are definitely limitations when you start to want to do more than that.
Yeah, okay. I guess it's just all relative to what you're wanting to achieve, but it's really important to be able to go into a project like this, which is going to take a lot of time and cost a lot of money, with your eyes open to what the outcome's likely to be and what pitfalls, if any, you're going to come across, I think.
Exactly. The other big problem sometimes with these OEM systems, when you're relying on a third party controller that's a small company, is the OEM system, it might not be totally sorted out. So you're getting all kinds of fault errors and the system's going into limp mode and shutting down. And you don't really know why, because it's an OEM component that you don't have the full understanding of, or the person that makes the controller might not have a full understanding of all of its different error codes and faults. Because like an OEM ECU, they have 100 different ways, 200 different ways that they can throw an error. And so whoever's doing that control work needs to make sure that that controller is tested and works reliably, because otherwise you just have, it's not fun to do a conversion and constantly have all these little gremlins that you can't fix.
No, absolutely. We want it to drive essentially like that factory EV would have driven, only in a different vehicle. In terms of just coming back to something you've kind of touched on already, but traction control with a EV swap. And I'm pretty confident in saying you did this with the Lotus Evora. Am I right in saying here, so for a start, just in terms of traction control on EV versus IC, the control can be just so much cleaner and so much faster because you've got instantaneous control over the torque, which we don't quite have with internal combustion engines. But am I right in saying your strategy with doing this was basically changing that torque request from the throttle pedal into the Tesla electronics?
Yep. It involved characterizing what the pedal translated to in torque at every different RPM point, and then controlling the system. So we're basically backing out the torque request from the measured calibration on the dyno that Tesla has done. So we're going backwards to what Tesla's pedal translates to torque, and then when we wanted to make a torque cut, that's done again, but exactly coming back through as a pedal again. So it's kind of going from torque request to torque request to pedal twice, because we have to go through Tesla's control system. But what's interesting, and what I'll note, is that despite the fact that you can make really, really fast torque changes to an electronic motor, you don't have the same performance as you do with an internal combustion engine. And that's because an internal combustion engine has a ton of inertia. So if you apply a bit too much power with an electric vehicle and you blow the tires off, you can very quickly speed the tires up way too fast. And then when they come back down, they drop down too far because the system can just change in speed so quickly. And of course, they don't have a fixed amount of friction all the time. As soon as you lose grip, the friction goes down, tire blows off, and then as it's coming back down, it starts to get more grip the closer it gets to its real ground speed. So it takes a lot of work to kind of reintroduce torque, even while you still have too much slip, but the slip's on the way back down. So it's kind of a derivative control, or in other words, the rate of change control.
As you're sort of explaining this, it kind of sounds like this is a PID control algorithm tuning challenge.
Yeah, but it's not just PID though, because it's PID with a number of conditions and clamps and things like this, because you want different gains at different times outside of just like a traditional PID loop. So it's very tricky. Whereas with an internal combustion engine, you can kind of just tell it, hold this RPM limit. The engine kind of naturally has this 50 or 60 horsepower brake applied to it all the time. It's always, if you turn off the fuel injectors, it's just kind of always trying to slow itself down. And it's also slow to speed back up. But when you have no inertia, you can just really quickly move the tires around way more than you would want to. So if you have too much of a cut, you end up having this really big, you know, lull when you tires grip back up, and you feel like, I lost a lot when the tires grabbed again.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, essentially, that lack of inertia in the electric motor is a benefit and also a bug
Exactly.
when it comes to traction control.
Yep. Exactly. So it's challenging, and tuning it to that limit is tricky because you can get into a situation where you reapply the power to try and not have that lull when the tire grabs again, but then just blow the tire back off right again because you don't know exactly how much grip the road has. So you can tune it perfectly for one day at one environment, but then when you're on a wet road, it's totally different, and the car's got no real way of knowing. So long story short, traction control with EVs is tricky, but it's even trickier when you're trying to do it through a pedal to a factory motor.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. At this point, with what we've just talked about, more in terms of the EV conversions, is what level of knowledge would someone have to have? Is the average home enthusiast who's got a fairly solid understanding of internal combustion engine technology, are they going to be able to perform an EV conversion, or is this just a whole different animal at the moment? And unless you're prepared to take our courses or spend an eternity sort of scouring the internet for information, be able to sort of then apply that and complete the conversion?
I think most of the people that have completed an EV conversion are the people that are more backyard mechanics. I think the people that are more, maybe call it engineer minded, maybe overthink it and don't even get started. Whereas it's kind of the people that just go for it.
And figure it out on the way.
None of it's insurmountable. You just have to do your research. And I think we've seen most of the EV conversions I've seen have just, it's like if you just knew a little bit more, if you just cleaned up these little aspects, it could have been a lot nicer and safer. So there's certainly people doing it. And I mean, I did my EV conversion in 2017. There's a whole bunch more information available now on how to do them. But you can't go into it thinking that you can just go on some web store, buy all the parts you need, and drop it all in. It's a lot of planning and doing your due diligence. But then once you have the components, aside from fabricating, mounting the components, it's not that much work. I mean, it's just a little bit of wiring and some coolant lines for the most part, and high voltage cables. It's more of just, because the industry is new and young, picking the components that will work is a challenge, and not making a mistake. That's really the only challenging part. After that, the putting the stuff together is, I would say, much easier than doing a combustion vehicle.
Just coming back to your Lotus EV conversion, I mean, 2017 to 2024, that's a lifetime in the world of EV technology. Looking back at it now, what would you change, if anything, about how you approach that conversion?
We've changed a few things already over the years. We've upgraded. Definitely, when I first started that conversion, there were no good chargers that you could just buy that were cheap and easy to interface with. So we've upgraded the charger, and that was a really nice change. Otherwise, what I would change, we're trying to get a good OEM air conditioning compressor to work now, so we can have like a high voltage air conditioning compressor. Otherwise, I would probably try and fit a more efficient, higher power motor, like a Model S Plaid motor, for example, if I could control it. But fundamentally, the conversion has aged pretty well. I don't think there's a lot I'd want to change other than the power steering. We have an MR2 power steering pump that is really loud, and I would like to have a full electric rack.
That's a little bit outside of the scope of the actual EV conversion, though, of course.
Yeah, but I mean, it's part of it because you don't have the pump running on from the engine anymore, so you have to do something.
Sure. When you talk about the high voltage air conditioning, are you literally talking for cabin air conditioning, or is
Yes,
this, yeah, okay, you're not referencing the thermal control of the batteries or anything like that?
you could do that if you wanted to take it one step further and add a chiller. The same compressor does the same thing, but you'd have to add refrigerant valves.
But this is just for cabin comfort.
Exactly. In this case, yeah.
Which is a little, again, a little outside of the scope specifically of an EV conversion, but is, again, something that you do need to think of. You can't kind of hang a conventional AC pump off the side of an electric motor. It doesn't work like that, like it does with internal combustion. And again, same with power steering. Of course, there's options for electric power steering, but yeah, you can't run a conventional hydraulic power steering unit.
Yeah, it's challenging. It does make an EV conversion if you want all those creature comforts. Those are additional things you have to worry about that you wouldn't with an engine swap so much. Usually someone's made a kit that mounts this pump and away you go.
All right. Well, at this stage, you've got me pretty excited for HPA's next project car, albeit it's
MX5.
probably not going to be an MX5 because it's too small. But that's good because I've learned something today, and that's really going to save us from a lot of heartache as we go down the line. So, look, I appreciate your time, Sasha. We'll move towards wrapping this up. I mean, I've already asked you these questions in our previous episode, so we'll see if anything's changed. We've got those same 3 questions we ask all of our guests. The first of those is, what's next in the future for you, On Point Dyno and Mountain Pass Performance? What's changed since 2 years ago?
For us now, we're starting to get into non-Tesla vehicles, so that's exciting. There's more of these high performance EV, purpose-built EVs that aren't so much vehicles that already existed that the manufacturer made an EV model of. It kind of called compliance cars that were forced, they were kind of forced to be made by some government somewhere, whether it was California mandating or whatever. And those cars, there's some that get you really excited. Like the Hyundai Ioniq 5N is a cool car. I mean, I don't appreciate the noises it makes and the fake gear shifts. And I'm not a big fan of the fact that it's an SUV, but otherwise I like that what Hyundai is doing. I think that they're going to have some cool stuff coming out. And also with the trucks, the Cybertruck and the Rivian, we're starting to make some cool parts for it. Took those trucks jumping and been towing with them. They're very capable vehicles. So yeah, that's kind of the main area for us, is just expanding into those markets.
With so many options available now, I'm just interested to get your perspective on how you decide what the next model to support is. Is it sort of from user requests or your own sort of knowledge of the market?
It's totally what vehicle that I would fall in love with. If I don't feel anything for it, then I'm not interested in touching it.
Yeah, fair. It's hard to get really excited about developing parts for cars you don't like.
I just feel like if I love it, probably other people do too. And if I'm not interested in it, because I'm not tied to any one brand or type of vehicle. I usually just love cool cars. So I kind of trust my historical feel on that. Like, whether it's a cool station wagon or, pickup truck or an SUV or like road car, we all know now, looking back, what cars are awesome and which cars are like whatever. And I'm just trusting that gauge for EVs.
Yeah. And if it's worked in the past, then yeah, it's probably fairly finely tuned. So keep on trusting it. The next question, is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to help get you where you are in your career today faster, or potentially avoid any of the pitfalls that you've seen along the way?
You know what's funny? What's really changed in the last 2 years? We've been looking for a new sales guy here at Mountain Pass for the last little bit. And the amount of people that are applying that have poor grammar or like poor literacy skills is quite shocking. And the amount of people that are now using AI as a crutch is quite shocking. So my advice would be, make sure you have good grammar, you can type quickly, and you're fast. I might be bringing this up because this is like a recent pain point for me, but these are basic things that, basic skills that if you want to be successful and you're not able to type it at least 60 or 70 words per minute. Just practice that, because whatever you do, your interface with the entire world is through a keyboard. So if I'm at 90 and you're at 40, I'm already twice as fast as you before I've done anything. Your efficiency cannot be there if you can't interface with the machine that you're working with, and the computer's doing so much. And I think the same goes for working in the shop. If you're not quick and you don't have the ability to be efficient, you need to work on that, because productivity is all people care about, not how hard you're trying. So
Yeah. I think just coming back to the AI crutch, obviously a very new technology that's developing very fast, and I don't think any of us really know what that's going to look like in another 2 or even 5 years' time. But I just wanted to share an anecdote here, because I think people are so worried about AI taking over everyone's jobs. And I mean, yes, I'm sure there will be some of that happening. But at the moment, between the hallucinations and the way AI writes things, I kind of, I can see, for the most part, I think when something's being written by AI. My daughter was applying for a job just recently as part of her year 8 sort of vocational training. And she had to write her job sort of, email to send out to these companies. And she used AI, which I'm all for, to help get her started. And I tend to use AI to kind of maybe sometimes get a bit of direction. But I find the way AI writes, I looked at what she had written, I'm like, I can see straight away that this is just being written by AI. It sticks out a mile away. I'm like, hey, cool. So now we've got a bit of a template that we can work off, but now let's make it your own. And I think that's really important. I think the people who really use AI as a complete crutch are probably at this stage not going to see a huge amount of success. But hey, as I say, that could be a very different trajectory in another couple of years. I just don't know.
yeah, it's the same thing happened to me. I was a couple emails deep, and then one stood out to me, and I was like to the guy, "Did you just apply for this job using all AI emails? And your job is to be writing
And
emails
if
to
you
customers?"
and if you did at least, please be honest about it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll move on. And our last question, Sasha, if people want to find you, see what you're up to, how are they best to do so? Maybe if they want to apply for a sales job and aren't using AI to write their application.
Oh, man.
Yeah. What are your social media accounts? How best to get in touch?
Yep, Mountain Pass Performance and Mountain Pass EV. And then if you're interested in the Hybrid Z, my personal Instagram is where I post most of that, and that's Sasha Anis 14.
Okay. Well, as usual, we'll put links to those accounts in the show notes to make it easier for people to find. Look, great to catch up again, Sasha. Always a pleasure. The EV side of things is definitely an area where I'm still learning, and I am excited to see where the technology goes. Also pretty excited to maybe be able to have the ability to look at doing an EV conversion. And if we go that route and develop a practical EV course, you can guarantee we'll be leveraging your knowledge very heavily to make sure that we get the right results. So thanks again for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to that MX-5.
No, it's not an MX-5 anymore, remember? All right, cheers.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Sasha, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high-quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Orphan from New Zealand, who has said, "All you could want. Love the work of HPA. Their training courses and podcasts taught me enough to build all kinds of components for my personal car, whilst being inspired by builds from all around the world. Legends." Well, thanks for the kind words there. Great to hear that you're finding the courses and the podcast useful and inspiring. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpaacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpaacademy.com/courses.